Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And we have a very special guest today. We have Michael Uebel. He studies intellectual history. He's taught theory and literature at the University of Virginia, Georgetown University, and the University of Kentucky. Currently an affiliate of the Office for the Associate Dean for Research at the University of Texas, Austin, and an international scholar of the British Psychoanalytic Council. His research focuses on the intersection of philosophy and psychology as it bears on the nature of self and ethical life. And his new book, available October 31st, is called Seeds of Equanimity: Knowing and Being. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you on, and thank you
Yeah,
so much for being here.
pleasure and honor to be here, actually. So, yep.
Absolutely, man.
Thank
Okay, and to start off, as we usually do, here's a quote from Michael's book. Flourishing existence depends upon a mind body that functions fluidly and flexibly, interacting with its surroundings in ways unhampered by partiality and hyperfocus. Here, equanimity is measured by the organism's range of response to an environment from which it cannot be separated. The independent status of mind, body, and environment renders it free from the ego lures of aversion, exemplified here as the wishful escape from death and of desire, here the hunger for acclaim. Our quote unquote seeing can interfere with our quote unquote being in another sense as well. That is, when our purpose in questioning the world is only to probe it for answers, to satisfy a self that seemingly stands apart from it. Holy shit, man.
Yeah.
what we're writing, like, holy shit. So actually, in this case, I think we're gonna have to kind of go back to the basics for not even just the audience, but for us as well. So Michael, could you actually first get into some of the specifics of mindfulness? So let's get into some of, because this is what people normally know. They know mindfulness meditation. They know Sam Harris. I know a lot of people use the Waking Up app and whatnot. So can you actually get into mindfulness and then get into your understanding of, let's say, your philosophy rather, and well, your understanding of equanimity and how it differs from mindfulness?
Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting to see an article that appeared this year in April. It appeared in Biological Psychiatry. It was called Enhancing Equanimity with Non-Invasive Brain Stimulation. And they did a really nice job of highlighting the central role of equanimity in mindfulness, right? So they cited the empirical research, which suggests how mindfulness works, right? And mindfulness generally works through this combination of top-down intentional attentional control and sort of the bottom-up sensory emotional processes, and that they see equanimity as having a huge role in regulating,
Mm.
right? So those bottom-up processes are what drives, they suggest, and I think this is right, drives really the psychological and physiological benefits of what we know to be, mindfulness, right? So it's attending to our breath, attending to our thoughts, our feelings, just any kind of inner experience. And so this attentional control is, really can refer to all the cognitive processes that enable the regulation and allocation of attention. And
Mhm.
they often involve networks of goal-directed behavior. And so what I thought about is how if equanimity operates, or sorry, if mindfulness operates largely in this top-down manner, and that's how it's generally been studied, and because it brings this very intense and precise attention to what's happening as it's happening, right? Like your breath or your thoughts or whatever, our moment-to-moment attention to sensations, thoughts, emotions. But I was thinking, as somebody who's been teaching mindfulness for about 15 years now to military veterans, this kind of precise attention can also create tension in the mind.
Mm.
And I think this is the moment in which, as I've discovered working with veterans, that it's helpful to practice the cultivation of a kind of open, boundless, and elastic awareness, which
Mhm.
is equanimity as I discuss it. And so, there's opportunities for us to develop this mind, which is vast like space, but it's not just the spatial component that's important, because there's wonderful meditations I'm sure you guys know, like sky mind and big
Mm.
mind kind of meditations, very helpful. um, but what I was interested in is not only the spatiality of that, which gives us, the affords us the space to allow pleasant and unpleasant experiences
Hmm.
to be examined, but also, right, the space allows those same experiences, whether they're pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, to appear and disappear, right, without
Right.
struggle, without resistance, without the ego. And so that's partly why I got so interested in equanimity. I wanted to sort of think about, as you say, kind of what would distinguish it from mindfulness, because the language we use to discuss mindfulness, like letting go, right, accepting, openness, those kinds of things are part of what equanimity is. But I wanted to recover aspects of it that aren't as often discussed, you know. So, like for example, stillness, the concept of stillness, right? So
Right.
that's a big idea in mindfulness as it's taught in the West. And I wanted to question this notion of whether equanimity really is stillness. I mean, is it a kind of sort of resolute immobility or almost hardness in the face of reality? And so one of the most famous equanimity practices that's taught at meditation centers and so forth is this idea of assuming the attitude of a mountain, right?
Mm.
Sit like a mountain. And that's often the way it's described, often the way it's practiced. And in my view, right, equanimity is not so much a safe place that one goes to in some effort to buffer against the world. It's a spacious kind of awareness rather than this kind of block or buffer against the tonalities of being. And so it emerges as this relationship to the world that folds everything in a constant process of enfoldment. It folds everything into capacious awareness, right? So you end up with, as I think one of my veterans actually put it, he he was describing equanimity as that which gave him a three-dimensional view
Mm.
of his own emotions that he didn't have before. He had a kind of a two-dimensional view, but he didn't have a three-dimensional view. I thought that was really interesting because, you know, equanimity kind of moves us then beyond accepting the things that I'm afraid of and what I'm not afraid of. It moves beyond binaries of that which brings me pleasure and that which brings me unpleasure, which is largely where Buddhism is centered, right? Buddhism is first and foremost about pleasure and unpleasure, suffering and not suffering. It's not really a moral system. And that's kind of what I want to get at in another book. But
Mm.
so we're in a place with equanimity where we're beyond rejection and acceptance, and we're just folding everything into a full range of experience. Does that make sense? It's like saying, you know, I don't know that, right. So I'm not sure that equanimity is this unshakable, unflappable, balanced sort of perspective on things because I don't believe anyone is ever really balanced as if that's an accomplished act.
Mm.
But one I think is there can be in a process of balancing. And so that's why I really kind of insist on the verbal rather than nounal nature of what equanimity
Mm.
is. So moving away from that notion of the achievement of some profound inner stillness. I think that's an option among others though, right? And so, you know, purely from a psychological therapeutic perspective, I think the key is not getting stuck wherever you find yourself. And so that means moving, right? And
Mm.
that's where I don't think equanimity is first and foremost about serenity, about calm, the kinds of things, you know, that we might use mindfulness to find, you know, and I'm not saying it doesn't, but I think equanimity offers us a little something a little different.
Yeah, that that
Yeah,
that's very interesting and more real and practical. Because I suppose most people have that common notion of, you know, to maybe to if their goal is to, let's say, seek peace of mind, right?
right.
They think, yeah, they do equate that with stillness, calmness. I have to get to calm. I have to get to still, and
Hmm.
maybe they do experience that, but then they think if you're not that, you're doing something wrong. It's like
Mm,
Mhm.
anytime they encounter anything other than stillness or calm on the path, for their goal of finding peace, they encounter like resistance or just not meeting that goal. But I could see how just sort of, and forgive me, I'm not, but I suppose to be in a state of sort of allowing whatever it is
Mhm.
you are witnessing to be, and then to be in that sort of action of constantly allowing. It doesn't have to necessarily be that you're experiencing peace at the moment. You could just be allowing whatever it is
mm,
to be coming into your awareness to occur. And so I guess I wanted
Mhm.
to ask you, how does the notion of equanimity um, differ from stoic neutrality? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little different. I think Stoicism, of course, has this mood of absolute acceptance, I think, right? With this sort
mm,
of even a kind of mood of love, right? The amor fati kind of thing, right?
Mhm.
I will love my fate, not just merely accept my fate, but really love it. And so, but if you look behind that notion, sort of like go to Seneca, for example, who talks
Mhm.
about the cosmos, right? The universe as the mother of us all. And nature is, as Epictetus says, nature's wonderful. It's full of love for all of its creatures, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So the difference between a sage and a fool in the Stoic view, right, is that the sage accepts what comes and the fool accepts only what he likes and attempts
mm,
to reject
Okay.
what he doesn't like. And so he's striving, the fool is striving egoistically against fate, right? He doesn't have the love of fate that I think is an important dimension of what the Stoics call ataraxia, right? That
mm,
sort of sense of, yeah, yeah. It is really interesting to think about because, all the great Stoics, Epictetus, Seneca, they all have this general principle, right? That it's not things themselves that disturb people,
mm,
but their opinions about them.
right.
They're and as I like to phrase it when I teach mindfulness, it's your relationship to those things.
Mm,
And that's what I think psychotherapy can alter. It can't alter the things often. Like chronic PTSD is not something that you can directly alter, but you can alter your relationship to your chronic PTSD, right? And
mm,
so or in anger management, I teach anger management to veterans as well. And
mm,
it would be from a stoic point of view, right? It would be, okay, the unwise sort of person will blame others when he feels badly, or
mm,
you'll blame yourself. And that's the that's when your training can really begin at exactly that moment. To blame, I mean, in the Enchiridion, I think Epictetus says, if you get to the point where you blame no one, then that's when your training is complete. I don't know
mm,
that, that's strictly speaking perfectly achievable,
Yeah.
but there is a real sense, I think. I mean, I do share that sense of that our pains, that which disturbs us, all do hang on our opinions, our relationship, right?
Mhm.
We're sad for our opinion, and Seneca says something like, "Each of us is as wretched as we believe we are," because
mm.
it's
Yeah.
that belief that we're wretched that makes the difference, right? And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
And I think when most people think of meditation, they think of it as a way, I guess in some sense, a form of equilibrium or probably a sense to sort of calm themselves or a way to calm themselves. But
Yeah.
interestingly, the way I think that you structure this sort of concept of equilibrium is very aligned with something called mentalization-based therapy.
Mm.
I'm sure you know about it, but like
Yeah.
I just wondered, did you kind of have that as an idea? So because so like for our audience, for people who don't know, the idea is essentially to develop what's called an observing ego. So there's not necessarily an end goal in mind. There's not like, okay, we're going to have an observing ego in order to calm ourselves. That's not really the point. The point is literally to kind of learn and observe and to just kind of allow the process to be whatever it'll be. So I wonder, did you kind of have that in mind when you thought of equilibrium?
A bit. You know what I had more in mind, I think,
Mm.
is acceptance and commitment therapy.
Can you say a little bit more
Again,
about
the
that?
same
Mm.
basic principle though, right?
Mm-hmm.
Set yourself up as an observer,
Mm.
right? Be in that position to label your inner experience
Mm.
so that you can achieve a distance on it, or put a phrase in front of your thoughts and your feelings, like I'm having the thought or feeling that, and then finish the sentence. So that
Right.
kind of, I had that in mind, that notion of kind of stepping back from and changing my relationship to, my thoughts and feelings. But you're right, mentalization, a lot of psychoanalysis, I quote a
Mm.
little bit of it in the book, is about the structuring of that observing ego.
Mm.
That's I think is crucial to any therapeutic work,
Well,
right? I mean, you have to have that. That's I think one of the first things to kind of encourage the formation of in a patient, for example. It's like,
yeah.
let's become a good observer.
And what I love so much about the way you describe it is, so I'm gonna, because I'm gonna butcher it, so I'm not gonna say verbatim the way you wrote it, but it was along the lines of, you definitely mentioned the folding, but it was something along the lines of sort of, kind of not necessarily rolling with it, even though that's how I would describe it, but it's
Yeah,
allowing, so right, so it's allowing the kind of experience to sort of unfold in the way it unfolds. So what I love about that is that there's no particular end goal. So with a lot of our patients, what we often have is, and this makes sense, so this isn't a judgment, but there's an obsessiveness to sort of get rid of or extinguish their symptoms. So even if it's not in the long run, if they're not necessarily looking for a cure, the idea is I want to feel better now. And so, when a person kind of comes in and they say, well, like you said, like complex PTSD is, well, not complex, but chronic PTSD is much harder to solve. So the idea is that, sometimes the best that we can do, and which is not necessarily a bad thing, but the best that we can do is create this sort of observing ego that just allows these experiences to unfold and transition into something else. And then you experience that next transition and then the transition after and so on and so forth. And sort of what I love about that so much is it takes the weight of that pressure off of the person who has these, let's say, emotionally turbulent experiences, and just difficulties controlling themselves. And then you sort of the kind of the sort of super ego who's telling them you should calm down or you shouldn't respond to this in a particular way. So what I love about this is it sort of gives them an easy, not maybe easily, but a simply achievable goal, a goal that they could kind of set and they could do within the moment, and they could even feel some sort of pride in because they have achieved it, and they could continue to achieve it.
right, right. Yeah, no, I mean, think of what PTSD, the way I think of PTSD is it's like this imperative to be aware that's inescapable
Right.
sometimes for people, right? And so they have to be aware of their surroundings and windows and exits and doors, and just that constant sort of awareness, but that's exhaustive. It's absolutely exhausting for those people. And so what I always found is that equanimity would be a way to, as I think I said, release people from that imperative to be aware, right? It's not the awareness that's the problem with somebody who has PTSD. I don't think, like, intrinsically that's not a problem,
Hmm.
but if you have to be aware, right, that's a problem, and that's what I think equanimity can offer some freedom from. Or
Rolling with the awareness. Yeah.
yeah, surfing the wave, as they
Mm.
might say in acceptance and commitment therapy. Ride the wave. No matter where you are on it, don't hasten to get past it. Just observe. If something's peaking, it's peaking. If it's leveling off, it's leveling off. If it's coming back down, that's what it's doing. Just hang in there and hang ten and ride it.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And something that, as we're using terms like observing
Mm.
ego, and I heard you say super ego, just out
Mm.
of curiosity, because I know there's this word is tossed around a lot, right? And um, in different circles, right? Whether it's the discipline of psychology, philosophy, or if you want to get into sort of Eastern philosophy, all of that. But out of curiosity, in the context of mindfulness, right?
Mhm.
What is the ego, and how does equanimity, or rather the state of being um, equanimous, if I'm saying that correctly,
Equanimous.
equanimous,
Yeah, yeah.
and how does the state of equanimous sort of uh, pierce that shell of the ego, or or get rid of it, so to speak?
Yeah, in it's interesting, right? So in mindfulness, I would say there's an observing ego, but it's the idea is to set up an ego which is less charged with reactivity
Mm,
to whatever's there, through a kind of floodlight consciousness that's helpful, that involves a surrendering of things, right? A surrendering of some of the egoic investments that we would make, perhaps based on our values, on the ways in which we process content and meaning, which have become, yeah. So in equanimity, you're favoring the means over the end.
Mm,
And then one could say that about mindfulness certainly too, um, where I'm more open to uncertainty, right?
mm,
And mindfulness teaches us, as you know, like to privilege the beginner's mind,
mm,
privilege that state of not knowing, and value, our receptivity, right, over forced action.
mm,
And so that's an aspect of equanimity that I wanted to highlight. But when I set it against sort of the spotlight consciousness, say, of PTSD, where, there's clearly a favoring of the variables that I can control, or favoring of my, I need to control things, right? There's like a drive to know things
mm,
right.
with those who have PTSD, right? And so what I wanted to suggest is that inherently isn't a bad thing. It's just, do you have the flexibility to move, back and forth between knowing and not knowing,
mm,
right? I don't want to move completely to a position of not knowing, right? I want to be somewhere where I'm in the middle, because the middle is going to give me the most freedom to move to either side as I need to, right? If I need to know, then I can move there, but then I also have the freedom, the flexibility, the elasticity, right, to go over to the other side and maybe not crave certainty.
mm. Yeah, and
Right, right. Yeah.
And that's sort of what I love about it. Well, there are several things, but this just is one of them. So, what I love about it is the flexibility part of it. So, essentially, as I'm sure you know, with PTSD, just for our audience, what happens is people kind of get stuck in their ruminative thoughts. And so, when somebody tries to either distract them or sort of try to talk them out of some of those thoughts or reframe them, if you want to use that terminology, what happens is a lot of times the person just reverts back to them. So, here, there's this fundamental aspect of there's a sort of a de emphasizing whatever the perception and whatever the thought is. And there's this kind of sense that whatever thing is in front of me is the important thing now, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the most important thing in the future. Meaning, if I focus my attention on something else, then there's this new unfolding, right? And it's sort of like very psychedelic in a way. It's like this is coming from
Mhm.
somebody who's never taken psychedelics, but it's very psychedelic in the sense of like whatever you focus on, it creates its own story, you know? So it's like if you're focusing on one aspect, let's say of whatever the vista is, that kind of has its own sort of like hallucination or story or whatever, right? And then you kind of move about to another sphere and that has its own story. But what I love about that is, again, it gets one out of that rigidity. And I think this is what's, well, at least from my perspective, this is what I think you focus on and what I think is the most important part of the work with mental health, with people who struggle with mental health and patients, is that sort of because of their inflexibility, fundamentally, they kind of get stuck, right? And what equanimity does is not so much about a stillness the way I understood it. It's more of a flexibility, which is why I focus on that term. It's more of a sense of like whatever kind of, what will be, right? Sort of like it's sort of like I can kind of direct my attention to other things and not have to constantly or have my mind constantly revert me back to this other thing because that thing was just important in its particular context in that particular time, but it doesn't always need to be.
Yes. Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I mean, you're right. I mean, so anytime thoughts, and feelings and perceptions present themselves, right, they can have a very compelling force, right? And they're magnetic, and we can get, like you said, we can get stuck there. But none of those thoughts and perceptions and so forth that we have exist in a vacuum, right? There's always a background that is there, but often isn't taken into account. It's kind of the figure and ground sort of model, right? So the figures really stand out to us in a Gestalt sense, right? We're
Mm,
drawn to those. They're, like I said, they're very compelling. But in equanimity, that figure and ground can actively shift places, can sort of oscillate fluidly so that the whole, which includes those thoughts and perceptions in all of their precision, can be apprehended more evenly.
mm,
Hmm.
And right, so that if you field and focus, I think that kind of got lost in some definitions of mindfulness. I mean, I think it was Langer who proposed that very early in one of the
mm,
first books on mindfulness. She's like, mindfulness is switching back between the focal and the peripheral. I mean, I'm
mm,
paraphrasing, but that's essentially what she was suggesting. And so what I thought of, in terms of equanimity was, okay, so equanimity would be the movement that allows for that switching back and forth from the very specific, the foveal, the focused and the general,
mm,
which is lost in PTSD and lost in a lot of things. I mean, obsessive compulsive disorder obviously would be lost. I know you've written a lot about perfectionism. I would think that would be something that's forfeited. If I'm truly a perfectionist, I've lost context. All right.
mm,
So I want to bring it, yeah, I don't know. This is a question for you, but I mean, I don't see perfectionism per se, right, a problem. It's
mm.
the fixity upon my my need to be perfect, right? It's a fixed need. There's the problem, as I see it, right?
Mm.
I mean, does that make sense? Yeah.
So
Yeah,
the
it's
way
that.
the way I would answer that question is okay. So it depends on what you mean by perfectionism, obviously. So
Okay,
if
right.
the sense is like like, oh, I'd want to be perfect, then I mean, but technically that doesn't. So to me, that at least would be meaningless because I think everybody wants to be perfect to some degree. So, but the way that I would define a perfectionism is a manifestation of obsessive compulsive disorder in the sense
Hmm.
that there's a depressing and then also desperate need to be perfect, which is the main difference. So again, it kind of depends, right? So if again there's a sense of like, hey, like this is something that let's say I might strive for, but I kind of know in the back of my head I probably will never get it. It's not sort of fundamental to my personality. Then if such a thing exists, and I would say for the most part as human beings, I think all of us in the back of our minds are like, yeah, I wish I was perfect. That'd be great.
Yeah,
That'd be so
yeah.
cool, right? But it depends on how seriously you take it and how much of a necessity it is. So one would argue that essentially when you write about equanimity, I would say that's pretty much antithetical to what perfectionism is. So for the
Hmm.
perfectionist, there's no such thing as unfolding. So unfolding has to be managed, controlled. It has to be sort of corralled. So the idea is whatever unfolding is, it has to be my unfolding, and I have to make these decisions, and I have to be the manager of this sort of world in front of me. So the way you write about unfolding is it sort of happens, and yeah, that's pretty terrifying for somebody with OCD.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Somebody with OCD and PTSD, of which is closely related, obviously, right? There's a lot of symptomatic overlap. Yeah, is that, there's that struggle, right, to pin down reality in some way.
Hmm.
And what I see is a lack of the kind of broad consciousness to accept everything, including, I suppose, failure. And I mean, so the more intensely we clutch reality, the more it slips away.
Yeah.
And I think this is something the Zen people are very good at talking about, right? That's where, Kosho Uchiyama speaks about opening the hand of thought, right? It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
mean I'm discarding my thoughts. I'm opening my hand upon which that thought sits. And there's a big difference between sort of clutching something, or even perhaps seizing it,
Mm-hmm.
seizing the moment,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? And sort of letting that recalibrate in the moment, on the fly,
Right.
a kind of balancing, and on one hand, and accepting and acknowledging on the other, and sort of knowing and grasping reality, which isn't a terrible thing at all, but it's a question of whether we can sort of easefully move. between those two positions, right? Between seizing something and opening up
Mm.
um, around those things. Yeah. How do we move smoothly with respect to our reality as it impinges on us all the time, you know, and the
Yeah.
people, yeah,
No,
yeah,
that's really cool. It's like being in a state of constant calibration.
Hmm.
Like you're not
yes,
you're not
yeah,
you're not like trying to say this is this or this is that.
right.
It's unfolding and you're just perceiving it as it unfolds and you're able to kind of take in um whatever it is that you're observing in its fullness,
Hmm.
essentially, without necessarily allowing like a filter of judgment or a narrowing of perspective or some kind of a label to sort of um, mask what it is you're truly interacting with.
Yeah.
That you're the
Hmm.
space that you're co-inhabiting, you're not abstracting it with like filter like illusory filters, let's say, that could kind of how should I say this? I mean, it depends. This is very ambiguous, I guess, what we're talking about. But this, for example, in conversation with a partner, right? If you are judging, labeling, maybe interpreting a certain way, you can take that. Like if we imagine like a tree and its roots and like all the different paths that that conversation could take,
Hmm.
you could, I mean, there, it can go a very negative way. It can go a positive way. It can go sort of a middle way, whatever.
Hmm.
But I feel like being able to sort of have that equanimous view as much as possible, as much as you can manage, right? Because it is, I would say, probably it's not. I mean, I think ideally we would love to be in that state all the time. I think probably people who practice this oscillate or vacillate, whatever's the word,
Hmm.
in and
Hmm.
out of that sort of knowing or that sort of state. But I guess where I'm going with this is as much as you could possibly be in that state, you kind of veer away from all of this sort of unnecessary suffering that could be caused with the judging, with the labeling, with the narrowing of perspective and that sort of thing. At least in the context, I guess, of relationship, since I brought that up.
Oh, can
Yeah,
I
Yeah.
ask a question based on that?
sure.
Yes.
Okay, so wait, I do it. So that's a great point. So then I would ask, okay, so Michael, would you say when it comes to equanimity, right? And we're thinking about it from a place of non-judge, what's non-judgmental, and trying our best to kind of distance ourselves from it in terms of our own kind of understanding of what things mean. Would you say that there's a heavy dose of humility involved, meaning that's a big part of what kind of gets us away from that judgment? And if there isn't, what does that actually look like?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think humility is a good word. The word I think I preferred when I was writing was deference, a
Hmm.
word that is a little problematic, but I wanted to be clear about what I meant by deference. And the way that I saw one of the primary ways to achieve that kind of humility is to always be capable of asking more questions,
Hmm.
right? Of not only of others, but of our experience. And so we're ceaselessly inquiring into and this is another important dimension, right? The what of our experience rather than the why, right?
Hmm.
Because we know causality can really mess things up if if you're constructing causal sort of chains, and this is what people with PTSD, I think, struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and coming to a place where you see that understanding something as a result of the why question that I may have posed and am likely to have done so, right, isn't really going to change my experience at all, right? That kind of understanding that's driven by a why.
Hmm.
There's a wonderful Zen phrase which says if you have understanding, things are just as they are, and if you
Hmm.
don't have understanding, things are just as they are,
Hmm.
right? And so
Yeah.
it's through questions that new possibilities for seeing and for knowing emerge. So it can't be, knowledge can't be just driven by our desire for some kind of answer or even some pleasant result that might come about as a result of some inquiry. And I don't think equanimity or equanimous knowing can, strictly speaking, always aim for neutrality or objectivity or absolute impartiality. Another term that's you see often almost offered up as a synonym, right, for
Mm,
equanimity. It's impartial.
mm,
Um, I think misguidedly some of those attitudes like neutrality, objectivity, impartiality get equated with equanimity. And what I wanted to suggest in the book was that what if we view equanimity as a set of possible orientations toward internal and external realities, which is motivated by questioning,
mm,
and so posing questions from multiple angles, right, of in an ongoing kind of way, which is not necessarily neutral, right? It might be affectively attuned, which is nice, and back to mentalization and attunement, right? So does that make sense? Like the questions that I think equanimity or the world poses for us, the answers that we might come up with, especially the why answers, the causal answers, right? The ones that are based in causality, they may or may not have, and usually they don't have lasting value.
mm,
But I've always thought that the real value is to be found in the very asking of questions,
mm,
right? And so any answer that I would discover as a result of my questioning would be at once provisional and their outcome, their content, right? Whatever I was seeking as some kind of outcome would forever be secondary to the act of questioning itself. So that's why I wrote kind of quite a bit about that, right? So like if we're going to think, if we're going to know anything, it's got to be built on this kind of ongoing inquisitiveness, right? The posing of questions and always being, like I said, capable of posing just one more question, just one more. It's similar to, I suppose, the improv theater kind of
mm,
yes and.
mhm,
It's like, okay, and what else is the question. I think that's often how I simply define mindfulness when I teach it, but I would certainly apply that to equanimity too. It's like, well, okay, let's say yes to something. We can still say no, but initially, let's pose the question and, right,
mm,
and what else is here? And that can be really helpful, relationally, just but interpersonally, if I'm
mm.
capable of that. Yeah.
I feel like you just answered what was about to be my next question, but I think I still have room to probably ask this. So in
Mhm.
chapter three, when you do talk about equanimous knowing, right? Like you
Yeah.
reinterpret knowledge itself and call it equanimous knowing, and you link it to Goethe's soft empiricism and Zen's way of tea. So I guess what I want to ask is, what does it mean to know something through participation rather than through analysis?
Mm.
Yeah, no, that was what Goethe, I think, was so
Good to
brilliant
say.
at, was being able to articulate what knowing something um, from the inside out rather than from the outside in, which is how we often try to grasp something,
Mm.
right? It's the scientific method. But it's important to realize Goethe was as much a scientist as he was, Germany's leading poet.
Mm.
And he was very interested in the possibilities of seeing something from the inside, right? So truth wasn't something found out there,
Hmm.
like the X-Files tell us, right?
Yeah.
Nor was it in here as a poet
Mm.
might offer us. It was for Goethe, it was found as what he called a sort of a revelation, which was at the point where the inner world of a human being meets the external reality. So
Mm.
it's that synthesis that I call it mimesis, right, where the world and the mind are reflecting each other actively. A very
Hmm.
prominent idea in Romanticism.
Mm.
He was very, very good at that. And he said there's a great story actually about him, which is has to do with the Strasbourg Cathedral.
Mm.
And so he goes to Strasbourg to study law. While he's there, he's struck by the cathedral, which is not to say much other than the fact that that was at the time the tallest structure in the world. So how could you
Mm.
not be struck by it? Well, this cathedral fascinated Goethe,
Mm.
and he observed it under a number of different conditions at different times of the day. This is kind of like Thoreau looking at the world from between his legs. He'd bend over and look at the world from that. He wanted to change perspectives. And so Goethe climbs the tower, right? And which for him is no small feat because Goethe suffered from vertigo. And
Mm.
so actually, there's a story that climbing that tower actually cured him of his vertigo. Um,
Wow.
but in the he so as he's looking at this cathedral, he said the sublime had entered into an alliance with something that was for him pleasing, but there was also something else. So just before he leaves Strasbourg to go back to Frankfurt, he mentions to some friends that he thought the tower, as it appears in 1770, was incomplete,
Mm.
and so he made a drawing of what the tower would have looked like had the builders stuck to the original plan, but he didn't
Mm.
have any knowledge of this original plan. Well, one of his friends did and showed him the original design and basically said, "You're absolutely right about this."
Huh.
And so it's fascinating because, the question is like, well, how did he know, given that he had no access to the original design? It wasn't common knowledge. And his answer, and this goes to your question, right? He answered that the cathedral itself told him.
Mm.
And he
Huh.
says, I observed it so long and so attentively, and he even says I bestowed on it so much affection, and that's really interesting. That he decided, or that no, the cathedral decided that it
Mm.
was ready to reveal to him its secret.
Hmm.
Mm.
It's
Wow.
really, really cool. I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's like it's this kind of way in which, as an observer or a scientist, you don't try to be detached. Um, you put yourself as much as possible into what you're observing.
Mm.
And it's yeah, I mean, there's real links obviously to artists and poets there, but and I think ultimately to Maslow, who I mentioned a bit in the book, with his notion of be cognition, this being cognition, which is a very flexible and really love-based, affection-based way of knowing the world and knowing, psychological phenomena.
Mm.
And Goethe called this active seeing. And so the world, yeah, it's really, really kind of neat where, it's the kind of presence that I think an objective scientist or a scientist who might describe him or herself as objective would shun, would not welcome.
Mm.
But
Interesting.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and I just have a little follow-up. How might this transform how we teach, learn, and conduct science if somebody were to sort of employ uh, this sort of relational view to their activity?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so one of the divides which has emerged recently in science and neuroscience and philosophers of mind, right, debate whether the qualia, which is
Mm.
associated with our subjective experience, our sense of things having some value, like the sunset is beautiful or something
Mm.
like that, how do you reconcile that subjective experience with the quanta, right? Which is the physical, the neuronal, the
Mm.
electrical exchanges that are happening in the brain that are associated with that experience, right? In
Hmm.
in, in mindfulness, there's that awe experience,
Mm.
which is often sought. And so the question would be, does it make sense to ask a question like, how many neurons does it take to feel that the sunset is beautiful?
Mm,
Right. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it changes science a bit because if we increase our comprehension of something, which is
mm,
science is all about, usually that's going to go in the direction of what's measurable,
mm,
right? What's measurable, and that's going to be risky. Steven Weinberg, the astrophysicist, once said that the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless.
mm,
Hmm.
And that's really interesting. And even Heisenberg, the guy who gave us the notion that detachment is, and with the observer effect and stuff, is not really honest when we observe, these quantum level sort of phenomena.
mm,
Um, in an interview later after his discoveries, he actually lamented the fact that science um, didn't bring the phenomenon of nature to our thinking in an immediate and living way, as he put it. And it did little to help our understanding of the world.
mm,
And it's interesting because, I mean, Goethe was I think the guy who would have said, okay, well, I've got a way to understand the world here, in that form of observation, which is not even going to try to be observed or detached. I'm going to be an
mm.
observer. I'm not even going to try for that. I'm gonna instead, as I say, put myself into it.
Hmm.
So that does change the way science is done, and I think Heisenberg even gestured toward that. I mean, and yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
it's interesting. There's a lot, yeah, lots of.
and what's so fascinating to me is just like pretty much how perspective affects the way you see a thing. So, and so what to me, again, what makes this, I think, super interesting is the fact that it makes you sort of question, and I'm not saying this super seriously, but I do think that there's some truth in it. It makes you question the whole notion of objectivity. So you recount the story of Ram Dass, which I want you to get into because I think it's super fascinating. And what I love about it, before you get into it, I want to make this one comment about it, is that I love that the perspective of something actually changed the thing in itself. So as you tell the story, not to kind of spoil it because I really want you to tell it, but as you tell the story, because it has to do with imperfection and perfection, and what I love about it so much is that, like, in some ways, and this is sort of what I hope a lot of my patients and just people see generally, especially people who read my writing, is that if you kind of think about it, perfection really is in the eye of the beholder, which is why for a lot of perfectionists, they keep chasing. So they get the thing and then they think, oh, well, here are the imperfections in it. So now I'm going to chase this other thing. Then they get this other thing and they're like, oh, well, here are the imperfections in this thing. So now I'm going to chase this other thing, and so on and so forth. So if you kind of think about it, right, it sort of depends. So I'm going to say two things. So it depends on sort of who's looking and how they're looking, number one. And number two is it's also super fascinating that just widening one's view and sort of going backward or going sort of further back. So if you kind of see the view from a little bit of a wider lens, it seems like whatever the imperfections are, somehow or other, within the sort of context of this thing, of this whole, they could kind of seem and feel all together as perfect, which is so fucking mind blowing. Because how is it that you're looking at a thing one way and you're like, here are all these flaws, and then you kind of not objectify, you kind of widen the lens, and then you're like, well,
Yeah,
actually, if you look at it on the whole, it actually seems pretty great. So can you
yeah,
actually get into the story of Ram Dass and actually the specifics of what I'm talking about now?
yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. So Ram Dass goes to India to study with his Hindu guru, and stays there a couple of years, I think, or more. Don't recall exactly how long he spent, but he was ready to go. Well, he thought his guru said it's time for you to go back to the U.S. and in order to teach
Hmm.
everything that you've learned. And Ram Dass balked at this, saying basically like, well, how could I possibly do that? Because I'm imperfect, right?
Hmm.
I'm spiritual. I have spiritual imperfections. I have impurities. I think these disqualify me from this humane mission, which I've
Hmm.
learned, and you're teaching me to love people, and how can I do that, right? And so the story is that his guru stood up and begins circling Ram Dass very slowly, very thoughtfully, and he's regarding him from all angles. And then he sits down and he looks. This is Neem Karoli Baba. He looks at Ram Dass deep in the eyes, and he says, "I see no imperfections.
Mm,
I see no
Yeah.
imperfections." And it's beautiful from my perspective because here's Ram Dass not just looking at him from obviously one angle, right?
hmm
He's getting up and he's moving around him completely. So, and seeing him and making it clear to Ram Dass that, like, the idea that, if we don't look at something from all sides with equanimity, then, you know, anything less than that is going to imperil spiritual generativity and right of a kind of wholeness that in fact I think the part of the story is that Ram Dass never departed in the first place from
mm,
perfection. He just thought that he did.
mm,
And there it was, right?
Mm.
Perfection is always there to be seen, but only from I suggest maybe I'm a little um, perhaps a little too doctrinaire on that, but the idea is that those truths about the self only emerge from the point of view of equanimity and in the surround, right? Sort of the
mm.
the 360 kind of degree view of things.
Right. And I would also add to that
You
that
know?
it probably, if, we usually give people the advice of like gain some perspective or, take some
Yeah,
perspective. And so I think that this fits in line with that because I think, obviously what happens, I mean, it's pretty cliched at this point, is that what happens is essentially when a person takes perspective, they start to de emphasize things that felt important, probably not so much anymore. And I think
Mm.
that happens with the person's imperfections based on what you're saying in this story. So I'm not necessarily, the way I understood it is not exactly super literally. So as the guru tells him essentially something along the lines of, well, you don't have any imperfections. I'm not sure that that's exactly what he meant. So what I think he was saying is that like these don't matter. He was saying like if you look at the bigger picture, like you
Mhm.
actually are pretty great and you have a lot to offer. And again, going into psychotherapy, this is sort of what we want from our patients. From we want them to sort of, focus on their strengths, de-emphasize their weaknesses, or at the very least, try their best to sort of account for them and address them and sort of deal with them in whatever way possible. But the point is to say that I love that the different perspective here, sort of again, that wholeness sort of allows the person to say to themselves, like, oh, hey, wow, this thing, and we could kind of link this to PTSD too, right? Here's this thing that I've been ruminating about, and oh shit, it actually doesn't matter that much.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that was what, yeah, he was stuck. All right.
Yeah.
He couldn't go back to the US. And yeah, because those ideas about himself, that specific idea about imperfection was not a matter of does he or doesn't he have imperfections. Like you said, it's that it's that attachment to the notion that he had imperfections that was holding him back,
Mm,
right? And so he didn't develop what Michael Eigen, the psychoanalyst, calls a democratic psyche.
mm,
Right?
Yeah.
It's a beautiful term, right? I mean, and I think it's a wonderful way to describe what equanimity is about in part, right? Is that capacity to entertain multiple viewpoints, to
mm,
be democratic. And the opposite of a democratic psyche, according to Michael Eigen, was the tyrannical one. The kind of the kind of person Eigen writes about who has a lot of rage or a lot of hatred. But even we could bring that down a few notches and just say, self-doubt and
mm,
self-blame and those kinds of things, right? And so when you learn to walk around yourself, as it were, in this kind of decentered way, right? I can walk around myself. Eigen says, like as if you were a sculpture, and
mm.
you're just going to see it from these different points of view. I think it's a yeah, yeah. It's a very vital way to engage
I love
with
them.
self. Yeah.
Yeah. In the book, you also several times you talk about this sort of idea of returning to the middle, like a place of balance, humility, creativity, right? In the context of, you know, the times that we're living in now with like a lot of political
Yeah.
polarization, that sort of thing. I guess, I mean, originally I was going to ask how does having an equanimous sort of viewpoint help you deal with that? But I guess maybe I'm going to shift it a little bit to kind of asking, what would it look like if, let's say, you're speaking to someone of what at least on the surface would be maybe not your particular political viewpoint or perspective. What would what would be an example of what that could look like if, let's say, you're in sort of an equanimous
Mm,
state when speaking to someone of a traditionally uh, opposing viewpoint?
mm,
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I sometimes bring this up in the teaching of mindfulness generally with the veterans I work with and so forth. It's like, um, how do you address yourself to the opposing 180-degree viewpoint, right? And what I always say is don't attempt to pick apart the other person's viewpoint based on the so-called facts,
mm,
right? Don't put your facts up against theirs. Let's say somebody's a racist, you are anti-racist.
Hmm.
And and you're going back and forth about, whatever qualities a particular race has or something like that, right? So an equanimous point of view would be to grant the other person their points of view and
Hmm.
then say, what are you missing? Okay,
mm,
if I grant them their points of view, I still have that capacity to ask, well, okay, so what do we have in common?
mm,
If I grant you all the differences that you, the racist, have brought before me, is that the total picture? Because anybody who's at least half reflective is going to say, okay, well, no, there are commonalities. I think that's missing, right, in our culture,
Hmm.
and the polarization, which is its symptom, right? That missing of the capacity to say, okay, what else is there, right? What are the points at which we are the same? If I grant you difference, because there's no doubt difference exists.
mm.
Right. I mean, that's not really a debate. And I don't know that we can, elevate certain differences over certain others. It's just like, okay, well, let's look for commonalities. So that,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, or I guess I'll ask this from a psychological perspective. When you're allowing that other person's viewpoint, right, versus fighting it or picking it apart, as you said, what's going on in the person who's uh being allowed their viewpoint, like because this is what I imagine, but I guess I'd want to hear from you. But what I imagine is, oh, my worldview is being acknowledged. It's
Like validated, you mean? Yeah.
or
Yeah.
acknowledged
Mm,
or validated
mm,
by at least being allowed to be,
yeah.
so to
Yeah.
speak.
Like platformed.
Does well, all right, sure. And so is in the person whose viewpoint is being acknowledged, or their worldview or whatever it is they're speaking about, is it that this allows for more sort of a rapport to occur where maybe none traditionally would have existed by feeling understood, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah.
And I think one is what if we're allowed to speculate what's going on
Yeah.
inside of another person,
Right.
right? The normal flow of the brain. This is what Ian McGilchrist is really good at describing. The normal flow is right hemispheric, seeing the totality of things
Mm,
t to the left, right? And the left is going to turn that vital flow into bits and pieces and facts
mm,
and that sort of thing, right? But the normal movement, and this is the problem that Ian McGilchrist identified, is that it doesn't get back to the right. So the normal movement would be right, left, right.
Mm,
But today, I think and in McGilchrist certainly suggests is exactly the same thing. We're stuck in the left,
mm,
right? We're stuck in that left hemispheric view. And I think that's what equanimity offers an antidote to. It's
mm,
an antidote to a devitalized kind of consciousness that I describe quite a bit. I use a lot of the terms that the Romantics used. I mean, it's
mm,
like the deadness of things emerges when I'm using that, that that left brain,
mm,
and sort of depersonalizing things and um, thinking in bureaucratic rationalities, right? And that are relentlessly consistent and
mm,
reduplicated. And sort of AI offers us that in some ways. But McGilchrist, if you've read his book, The Master and His Emissary, he's like, okay, so if you have a world that's dominated by the left hemisphere, that's actually very much and eerily like the skewed visions of certain brain damaged patients.
mm,
I mean, Kurt
Wow.
Goldstein was identifying that as early as the 30s and 20s, and so when he was working with World War I veterans and brain injuries and lesions and so forth, right? So in this left hemispheric kind of autistic, and I don't want to use that in a strictly clinical sense, but this kind of autistic approach, there's a there's a danger there, obviously, right? Because empathy becomes, we were told earlier this year, the fundamental weakness of Western
mm,
civilization.
mm,
And it's a bug you're right, that can be exploited.
mm.
And that's, yeah, so there's real relevance for bringing an equanimous kind of perspective with respect to these larger issues of, polarization and difference and so forth.
And
Yeah.
then also picking up on the theme of psychoanalysis. So, because you mentioned before a little bit of the connection and the democratic mindset. So, how else have you sort of seen in terms of the concept of equanimity? How else have you seen it relate to psychoanalysis in any meaningful way?
Mm, yeah, I didn't push the psychoanalytic very much
Mm,
in that, but I do think Julia. I'll take Julia Kristeva as a nice example of a psychoanalyst who I do like quite a bit because she's also quite a philosopher.
mm,
Where she thinks of subjects, humans, right, as being forever in process,
mm,
Right.
right, on process, right. It's this notion that is we're not only in process, but we're also, in French, that expression translates to being on trial as well.
mm,
Uh,
mm,
we're in process and we're on trial.
mm,
And this processal kind of person, this subject, um, is not necessarily a reality that's posed to us in advance in some ways. It's actually something that comes about, she says, through experimenting
mm,
with subjectivity, and I think that's an idea that I didn't expand on a lot, but I did want to think about, is like, what does it mean to experiment
mm,
um, with our own subjectivities a bit. And yeah, there's a term in Sanskrit called ahipasika,
mm,
which means basically to experiment with the self, or anything for that matter, to come at things in an open way, rather than a closed way.
yeah.
Um, yeah, it's
Yeah,
something
and what I
yeah.
like about that is it's sort of it's a take on analysis that I think I'm not saying, so okay, to be clear, I'm not saying that the person who does practice psychoanalysis has this take, but it's a take on psychoanalysis that I think so it differs from I think the common sort of understanding of what we think of analysis as being. So analysis usually is conflated with judgment, whereas I think that from what you're saying, the psychoanalyst essentially doesn't see it that way, and the psychoanalyst may see analysis more as a form of curiosity, where even if there are
Mhm.
judgments, they're not necessarily taken super seriously, where interpretations are constantly molded and remolded from different perspectives.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Those shifting perspectives are absolutely what's necessary for, like you say, curiosity and ultimately wisdom.
Yeah.
You know, I think
And
that's
what
the
and,
yeah.
and what I love about this, and I wonder if you'd agree with me, would you say that one of the sort of like, I don't know if you'd call it the healing components, but one of the sort of I guess remedying in some ways components is the fact that there really is no finality to it. So if you go into this process, and I like how you kind of use it as a verb rather than a noun, right? As though it's like some sort of end state. If you go into this process, the idea is that there's no finality, so there's nothing to really obsess over, right? And there's nothing to perfect. It's something that again, going into the term of unfolding, it's something that should sort of continue to happen just because it's sort of just like life, right? It just exists.
Hmm.
And I think if anything, like again, when we're thinking about sort of obsessiveness and when we're thinking about perfectionism, the idea is that there's some sort of end goal and some end state to get to that obviously once you get to, you're sort of free from all of the burdens of your emotions. But what I love about this, and again, this is sort of my question, would you say that one of the better parts of this or one of the more sort of freeing parts of it is the fact that it's antithetical to finality?
Yeah, absolutely. Right,
Mm,
right. And that's a big part of the book was to push the non-teleological dimensions of equanimity. In fact, to suggest that that's precisely what it is. It doesn't involve it nor depend upon final a finality, right?
mm,
Or even a suspension of judgment in all circumstances. Because if we suspend judgment, that can be part of the process, right? The open-ended sort of process of
mm,
equanimity. That's fine, but that isn't the end.
mm,
That's not the telos of it. And so that's why in the last section of the book I write about playing
mm,
and playfulness, because I think anybody who's written about playfulness, any philosopher, has always, and in fact, that's usually produced as the essence of what play is that it doesn't have an end. It doesn't have, it's open in a way that a lot of life is not open, and that's why we might enjoy play precisely as a release from
mm.
those kind of imperatives to bring things to some sort of finality. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I'll also just
is
add this. So one of the main reasons why, at least I think, we don't like heavily edit the podcast, we don't really at all, is because I kind of like the sort of clunkiness of it. The fact that we
yeah.
sort of on the spot have to think of questions and then we have to kind of like sort of, as we're even like thinking about them, we have to kind of chisel away at them, like figure out like what could be important, what isn't. But what I like about it is sort of we're learning in the moment and in the process. So I assume this is what it's like when somebody's listening to a lecture or in some sort of group discussion, where like I would assume that all of the thoughts and questions that we have, our audience probably would have too. So I kind of like the clunkiness of it. There is a
Mhm.
seriousness to it, but then there also kind of isn't, where I think that we don't take ourselves so seriously, where the idea is like our questions have to be perfect. So from my kind of perspective, I think the idea is like whatever's just sort of is curious or whatever we're curious about is just important enough. And then the sort of imperfect way it is, it's important enough to just present as it is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's great. I mean, I think that's the essence of equanimity as well,
Mm,
is just that to be free from those constraints, right? To have to be, I don't know, to have to be smart or to have to be
mm,
useful, right? I
mm,
mean, that's why we enjoy play, because it's free of utilitarian considerations,
mm,
right? And it's a reprieve from the instrumentality which it's so much defines us. And so we can be spontaneous, right? We can open to the possible or the random, things like that. Right? So yeah, if things are desirable as ends in themselves, like gameplay,
mm, mm-hmm.
right, rather than as means to some further end, I think, yeah, I think we recognize that that suspension of the useful is you know, at the very least, an enjoyable state.
Mm.
Um, you know, I thought about like when I was thinking about playing, I thought about cheating, right? Because like, if somebody cheats at a game, I thought, what is so disturbing and
Mm.
unsettling about a cheater? I wanted to suggest it wasn't necessarily the fact that you're being victimized by the cheater,
Mm.
right? The card cheat or something like that.
Mhm.
It's rather that the recognition of their dishonest act has changed the relationship of means to end in a pre-calculated way,
Mm.
right? So that the end is now fixed.
Mm.
It's known, and that's yeah. There's no suspense
Mm.
anymore because the
Mm.
cheaters rigged the thing,
Mm.
and so yeah. So playing is like equanimity because it's this context for being when the reasons for inhabiting that being, like playing a game, are just intrinsic to being itself, right?
Mm.
To being a player of a game, for example.
Mm.
Um,
Right. And sometimes the
yeah,
most unpredictable things are the ones we enjoy the most. That's what I kind of love. Like people
yeah,
kind of try to
Mhm.
sort of, force or control, and then the end result is still not so great. And then oftentimes when we go into something spontaneously, sometimes we enjoy it more than anything else.
For sure. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. There's a non-seriousness
Hmm.
to play, which is just allows us to relax and give of ourselves and our egos, right, over to something that's moving, for example, that's without purpose and intention, and it's just as it is, without forcing it. I mean, it's a very Taoistic notion, right? It's
Mm.
sort of the Wu Wei, like don't take action, but don't force action, right?
Mm.
Because if you're forcing it, the outcomes may be precisely what you didn't want or something harmful.
Right.
Um, so kind of letting go of the fixed and the prescribed. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
It's
yeah,
something, I guess maybe one of our final questions. So I wanted to ask,
yeah,
what small first act of equanimity
Mm.
can listeners try to take today, or take today rather?
yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, like an actual, maybe a
Either an act
practice.
or a practice. Yeah.
A practice? Yeah. Yeah, no, I was thinking about this recently because I had to give this talk. It was like 3 hours long in Santa Fe at a conference, and it was two other mental health clinicians. And so I
Mm.
was thinking, like, I've got to offer something that is practical. I can't
Mm.
just
All right, philosophize.
theorize
Yeah.
about all
Yeah.
this sort of
Yeah.
stuff, which is wonderful. But yeah, but ultimately,
Mm.
uh, yeah. So there's some really nice short practices I like. And one of them is to see, this actually comes from Jack Cornfield.
Mm.
It's
Oh,
to
okay.
see everybody as enlightened,
Mm.
right? It's this kind of reflection that changes your relationship to difficulties and difficult people, right? So
Mm.
you picture the world filled with Buddhas, right? And what are Buddhas? They're enlightened beings, right? And they're there to help you.
Mm.
That's their mission. They want you to be enlightened just like them, right? And so you go through a day or maybe a couple hours or something, and you just imagine that everybody you encounter is there to teach you in some way.
Mm.
So whoever you encounter is acting as they do, for your benefit, and they're providing the teaching and even the challenges that you need in order to become like a Buddha, more
Mm.
aware, more equanimous. And so you kind of take some time to reflect upon what that is like in terms of how it's changed your perspective,
Mm.
having done that. Imagining that there's these enlightened teachers all around you, So it has a kind of yeah, he doesn't explicitly frame that as an equanimity exercise, but I certainly think of it as one that opens up that kind of mobility of perspective that we've been talking about. And it's like, okay, well, what if how my relationship to these people is markedly changed now because
Mm. The
I've
perspective has changed. Yeah.
I'm
yeah,
gonna
yeah,
try
the
that.
people haven't changed. The
Hmm.
people haven't changed, but
Yep.
but my perspective on them has changed, and maybe that has helped me, have a more, more wise relationship to them, and yeah, so I've always liked that simple practice. Yeah, kind of getting in a state where things are more open, more open.
Mm.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
All right, man. That was, I
yeah.
think that's a great endpoint. All right, Alan, final questions for Michael before we wrap up.
Yes, of course. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Well, yeah. So I want to say the book is going to someday be available on Amazon. It was initially announced in July, and they kept pushing it back.
Mm,
And I think that's largely has to do with importing the book because it's actually
mm,
printed in Italy. So it will
mm.
be available. It is available in other channels, eBay and so forth. But and it's been out in Europe since the end of June.
Mm.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
so there's that. The other thing is, yeah, I obviously social media. I mean, the best thing is to follow the kinds of things I'm up to is on academia edu,
Mm.
and just yeah, my profile there. I post pretty much everything that I write and have had published and so forth. So yeah,
Gotcha. All right, Michael, thank
yeah,
you so much, man. Such an
yeah.
enlightening episode.
And I'm not gonna.
Thank you.
I'm really not just saying this. I think you're one of my favorite guests this year, if not the most favorite. I just don't.
Uh,
I don't want to like do disservice to
Yeah,
anyone
I
else.
gotcha.
So like just in case, but I think so. So it's
yeah,
a pleasure to have you. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you. No, a real pleasure to be here, and my first time as a guest on a podcast. So that's fun.
I
That's
and I
nice.
love that you picked this one.
Nice to hear. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Absolutely. All right,
absolutely.
Michael. Thank you for
Yep.
everything again, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Take
Yep.
care.
Thanks, guys.
All
Yep.
right.
All right, awesome. So, of course, everyone, as you know, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize underscore podcast. Like, subscribe,
Hit
hit
the
the
bell
bell
on
on
YouTube.
YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.